And the most perfect example of this, like maybe we can find Habib doing Sambo. So yeah, I didn't know this. I don't know. Like, I mean, I've researched a lot about this because the reason that I know a lot about this is because I hear people talk about, I listen to like, I watch a lot of MMA and I hear like the bullshit things that like the commentators say about, oh, Taekwondo was invented by a guy in prison. And then I like look it up and then I'm like, okay, well, what other martial arts have been developed in like some type of anti-colonial struggle? And then it turns out a shitload of them. If fighting in the age of loneliness captured the mood of the post 9/11 neoliberalism, where cage fighting became a metaphor for a culture that was atomized and isolated, then the period of now, 2016 to the present, I would say demands a different diagnosis. This age is fighting in the age of collapse, because this isn't just more of an intense version of loneliness. It's qualitatively different. Loneliness is a symptom. Collapse is the system failing outright. It's not about individuals feeling disconnected anymore. It's about the collective structure we thought that was permanent, showing itself to be hollow, corrupt, and dead. What we're living through right now is the slow motion unraveling of liberal democracy, economic stability, and ecological balance, and even a narrative coherence. And somehow, in the middle of it all, the fight game not only continues, it thrives. Not because it resists collapse, but because it reflects and profits from it. Start with the obvious. No one believes in liberal institutions anymore. The idea that governments solve problems through debate, reason, and compromise is now either a punchline or a nostalgic fantasy. Electoral politics has become pure reality television. Courts serve the powerful, bureaucracies are outsourced, and every liberal state solution to crisis, whether it's a pandemic or a housing shortage, is to contract the response to consultants or private equity. Governance is gone and what's left is theater. In that sense, the UFC is the perfect institution for this era. It doesn't pretend to be democratic. It doesn't hide its monopoly of power. It's efficient, cruel, and completely uninterested in legitimacy. It exists to generate content, not meaning. Dana White is a one-man autocracy, and he's proud of it. And the UFC doesn't resist collapse. It is the model for it. It shows what power looks like when it's stripped of its pretense of fairness, of justice, of accountability. And every year, you see this, because every year the planet gets hotter, poorer, and more unstable. And every year the UFC holds more events. It's more successful and more profitable. Fights go on during wildfires, hurricanes, wars, and plagues, and the pandemic didn't slow the UFC down. It just made it stronger. The Fight Island era wasn't a desperate move as much as it was a business opportunity. And they were right, and the audiences loved it. And it's not resilience as much as it just like systemic denial. The UFC's refusal to acknowledge reality mirrors the crackpot realism of how capitalism functions under collapse. It just keeps going. It keeps producing. It keeps selling. It never stops. The fighters, of course, the workers, are the ones who bear the brunt of it. They're the ones who are flown around the world on short notice, often injured or sick, to fight in front of oftentimes half-empty arenas or to a streaming audience that may not remember their name by Monday morning. And what passes for politics in this space is usually just aesthetic posturing. Dana White himself loves Trump. Multiple fighters we've seen have saluted Trump in worse figures than Trump. People wave American flags, Confederate flags, call out Marxists like a Marxist cabal that doesn't exist.
I want to dedicate this fight to all the people who've been hurt by Marxist ideologies. There are millions of you, and I know it. And it's just a fight. I know it's not much, but I want you to know that I love you, and I understand the pain. I don't completely understand, but I love you, and I understand your pain.
But in the end, like, this is not ideology. It's aesthetic branding. There's no coherent worldview here. It's just
Globalists. All these globalists, they're trying to push a political and corrupt agenda. And I hope you understand that democracy is a fallacy. Democracy is not the real government. So
it's cosplay for a political moment where actual policy doesn't matter, and strength is whatever gets the most eyeballs and the most clicks. And that's why figures like Colby Covington and Sean Strickland can succeed. They don't have to believe in anything. They don't have to sell you any type of idea. They just have to project the kind of aggression that sells. It's not about belief, it's about vibes. Fighters become avatars for a culture trained to react. not think. As material conditions get worse, higher rents, lower wages, fewer social guarantees, distractions become more valuable. And the UFC doesn't just sell fights, it sells escape. Blood, sweat, and a coping mechanism. This is Rome in the end. Bread and circuses, but the bread has fentanyl in it, and the circuses are owned by Disney. Fighters train for years just to become a clip on TikTok nowadays. That's how it works. If they're lucky, they get turned into memes. If not, they're forgotten. Meanwhile, geopolitics leaks into every corner of the sport. Arab fighters can't get visas. Ukrainian fighters doing nationalist promos. American soldiers turned fighters get platformed as heroes. Every fight is a little cultural war battle. Every weigh-in is also some type of diplomatic statement. It's sports washing, but it's also kind of ideological laundering where power and violence get framed as a neutral competition. Once a fighter was a competitor, maybe a warrior. Now they're a gig worker in a hostile labor market. UFC contracts are predatory. There's no union, no pension, no real bargaining power. Sponsorships are locked down, and fighters beg for bonuses after fight. They have to side hustle gigs, start podcasts, or sell crypto scams just to get by. They're not just athletes, they're content creators trapped in a survival game where the only real reward is attention. Winning doesn't even matter. It's trending that does. Ask Bilal Muhammad. Collapse in the UFC is the business model at this point. And still, the audience tunes in because there's something comforting about that cage, right? In a world where nothing makes sense, the fight does. You know why someone gets punched in the face. You know why someone taps out. It's violent, but it's coherent as hell. It makes it feel more honest than anything else right now. But that honesty is a mask. Like, that's what it is. The cage doesn't reveal collapse. It obscures it. It turns systemic failure into a personal drama. Fighters are told that if they just work hard enough, if they grind hard enough, they'll break through just like the rest of us. It's a lie, and it's a beautiful one, and we buy it every Saturday, and it feels just like the truth that we buy to when we wake up in Monday morning, right? And so this is the end of the age of loneliness and the beginning of fighting in the age of collapse. This isn't fighting in the age of loneliness anymore. That was the story of isolation, of individuals who were lost in a world without meaning. Now, we're all together as individuals watching the same thing collapse. Fighters don't just battle opponents, they battle irrelevance, precarity, and the algorithm. They fight for the right to be seen before the system spits them out. The audience doesn't watch to forget that everything's falling apart. They watch because the cage feels like the only place where something real is happening. It's not resistance. It's not rebellion. It's ritual. That's what it is. The cage is the cathedral of the end stage of capitalism, a place where we gather not to hope, but to feel something as the world burns around us and we can't feel it. And when the bell rings and the blood is wiped off the canvas and the post-fight interviews wrapped, we scroll to the next fight. Because what else is there? That's what it is. That's essentially what they're selling us, and that's what we buy because we need it. And that's why it's also like a commodity that needs to be like controlled because it's powerful. Like, sports are powerful, especially martial arts and combat sports, because combat sports are usually framed like martial arts specifically are usually framed in one or two ways, as either ancient mysticism or just straight up recreational violence. They're either sold as self-help rituals in pajamas or as ways to get shredded while pretending you're in like a John Wick action movie. Because combat sports are usually framed, like martial arts specifically, are usually framed in one or two ways, as either ancient mysticism or just straight up recreational violence. They're either sold as self-help rituals in pajamas or as ways to get shredded while pretending you're in like a John Wick action movie. What gets left out is the obvious, is that most martial arts didn't come from peace, they came from oppression. They're not just about fighting, they're about surviving systems that are designed to break you. And they've often functioned as the cultural memory of people who weren't allowed to write their own history. When you look at capoeira, when you look at Filipino eskrima, Indonesian pencak silat, Soviet Sambo, not to mention sorry, I'm going to butcher all of these pronunciations. North Korean Kyuk Soldu, or even the original development of Taekwondo. You're not looking at fitness routines. You're looking at legitimate human adaptive technologies of resistance born through the struggle of like the colonized plantations, the occupied territories, or the post-revolutionary states where violence wasn't abstract. It was very real. It was structural, legal, and total. These times were these places where these arts were developed. They weren't practiced for sport. They were practiced because the alternative was your death. And capoeira was developed under slavery in Brazil, disguised as a dance because enslaved Africans weren't allowed to train to fight. Filipino eskrima survived 3 colonial occupations by being passed down in secret. Pencak Silat helped arm the Indonesian anti-colonial resistance, then got rebranded as a national identity product post-independence. And then even Sambo, the outlier in being a top-down state project, was still designed to produce a new kind of worker soldier who can embody the Soviet future in their actual body. And these were not leisure activities, they were revolutionary praxis in motion. And that's the key word here. Praxis. These martial systems reflect not just theory, but embodied political action. They are literal translations of resistance into human form. You can trace ideology through them, not in slogans, but in stances, in rhythm, in reflexes. In they are how people who had no institutional power created it, by building bodies that could resist, evade, and strike back. In absence of sovereignty, they train sovereignty into their bodies. This is also why martial arts has been relentlessly co-opted. Once a martial art becomes legible to the state or to the market, it gets hollowed out. That's why the UFC is what it is. That's why it's also associated with so many quote-unquote problematic figures, because it's meant to shoo you away. And that's a part of the hollowing of it out, is to take away any of the actual essence of it. Habib said the night of the McGregor Habib fight where he jumped over the cage, he said, guys, this is honor sport. And that's the thing, is that's gone. The UFC took that away from it.
I'm human being, and I don't understand how people can talk about I jump on the cage. What about he talk about my religion? He talk about my country. He talk about my father. He come to Brooklyn and he broke bus. He almost killed couple people. What about this? What about this? Why people talk about I jump over the cage? Why people still talk about this? I don't understand. And I want to say something like people little bit, it's not people, I think it's media. Media a little bit change MMA. This is respect sport, This is not trash talking sport. This is respect. So like I told you before, guys, I want to change this game. I don't want to people talk about opponents, talk about his father, like religion. You cannot talk about religion, you cannot talk about nation, guys, you cannot talk about this stuff. And this is, for me, is very important.
Yeah, that's the thing, is once a martial art becomes legible to the state or to the market, it gets hollowed out systemically. And Taekwondo becomes an Olympic sport. Capoeira becomes a tourist attraction. Salat gets a government seal of approval, and suddenly the thing that once held people's trauma and survival becomes a part of a branding campaign. The art doesn't disappear. It gets neutered, declawed, and sold for profit. But the real thing is, it's always still there in the backyards, in the unfilmed classes, in the movements that aren't for show, because martial arts, the real ones, the true ones, are about continuity under siege. That's what they've always been forged out of. They preserve what can't be written. They train memory into muscle. And even when they're dressed up for an audience, you can still feel what they once were. Resistance encoded into human flesh. When everything else is taken away, the last thing they can't confiscate is how you move. And that's where the fight starts. Capoeira isn't just a martial art. It's what happens when people who are denied every form of human agency find a way to fight back using rhythm, movement, and deception. It was created by enslaved Africans in Brazil under Portuguese rule, a settler colony built entirely on extraction and violence. In that context, any form of physical autonomy was a threat. So when the enslaved developed a combat system, they had to hide it in plain sight. And that's why capoeira looks like dance. It's why there's music, and the kicks are real, the sweeps and the feints and the acrobats, they're all combat techniques. But if you're a slave and you start doing fight drills, your captors are very quickly going to notice. So you pretend that you're playing or you're dancing. You turn your training into a ritual. You build a whole cultural language that says this isn't rebellion, it's an art, just bodies moving. And that's not a metaphor, that's survival. That's legitimately praxis. And capoeira is an adaptive response to total domination. It preserved identity and readiness inside a society that wanted its practitioners to have neither. It wasn't created in isolation. It developed in the Quilombos, the autonomous communities of escaped slaves, especially in Colombo das Palmeiras, which lasted for nearly a century. And these were not just hiding spots, right? These were legitimately like autonomous zones, anti-colonial republics, and capoeira was one of their main tools of survival. After the abolition of slavery in Brazil in 1888, which, like most liberal reforms, similar to in America, it was not about justice, right? It was more about preserving the state than it was about any type of social justice. But after that, capoeira didn't become a celebrated part of national heritage in Brazil. It was criminalized for decades. It was illegal to practice it publicly. The elites feared that the same art that protected the enslaved peoples might empower the poor and the black underclass. So they did what elites always do. They branded it dangerously, disorderly, and criminal. And it wasn't until the 20th century that capoeira was repackaged for national consumption under Brazil's Estado Novo dictatorship, transforming this form of resistance into a sanitized performance of Brazilian culture. And in other words, they did what every liberal capitalist society eventually does with a revolutionary art. They made it safe for the middle class to consume. But capoeira's roots are very much still there. In the ronda, the circle where practitioners play capoeira, there's still a deep current of subversion. So you're watching two people read each other's bodies in real time, masking violence as dance, hiding rebellion in joy. It's a living artifact of a time when fighting back meant disguising your resistance as like a celebration. And capoeira doesn't just teach you how to fight, it teaches you how to survive a system that is trying to break you. That's what it is. It's a martial art born from the most brutal conditions imaginable. And it still carries that legacy, not as a nostalgia either, but as a warning. And every beat and every swing of the leg is a reminder. The oppressed always find ways to fight back, even when they have to smile and dance when doing it. So yeah, depending on the region and the lineage, eskrima, these really aren't like elegant sport forms or picturesque friendly kata routines. They're systems of violence developed in a context where violence wasn't recreational or theoretical. It was the difference between autonomy and annihilation. And like most martial traditions forged under colonial rule, they didn't start as a hobby, they started as a necessity. And these arts emphasized weapons first: sticks, knives, machetes, spears. That surprises many people because Western martial arts romanticism tends to begin with the empty hand and work its way up usually under this illusion of morality that scales with lethality. And the Filipino systems flip that completely. You learn to fight with a blade before you learn to box, because in the Philippines, under 300 years of Spanish colonization, the weapon was always the most practical means of enforcement and also in resistance. The colonizer is the one who set those terms, right? During Spanish rule, the Filipino martial traditions were deliberately suppressed, and the colonial regime banned the carrying of blades and outlawed any type of training in eskrima and other type of traditional martial arts, and targeted the transmission of these type of indigenous combat systems. And what they feared wasn't just like physical rebellion, it was the cultural continuity. That's literally what it is, right? The ability to pass down a system of movement, timing, and strategy that wasn't theirs, that they couldn't conceive. And so the practitioners of this went underground and they trained in secret. They passed knowledge through family lines, encoded in dances, games, and rituals. And what emerged wasn't a hidden art. It was a language of resistance. And you see that most clearly during the rise of the Katipunan in the late 19th century. It was the revolutionary group that fought for the Philippine independence. And they didn't fight with ideas alone. They They use bolos, Filipino machetes, and they use the combat system that the Spanish spent generations trying to erase. The Catipaneros weren't improvising either. They were deploying an underground martial tradition refined over centuries of insurgency. And it didn't stop with Spain. When the U.S. occupied the Philippines in the early 20th century, because empires don't retire, right? They just rebrand. The same martial traditions adapted again. Filipino fighters in the Philippine-American War and later World War II guerrillas against the Japanese kept these very same systems. Even in diaspora, Filipino martial arts became survival tools. Filipino immigrants brought the art to North America and have taught it quietly, often only after proving that the student could be trusted. And similar to Taekwondo, this is practice in its deepest sense, right? It's not a sport, it's not a performance, it's a living method of resistance under the material conditions of occupation. It teaches you how to move, how to kill if necessary, and how to do it even undetected when the law forbids it. And Eskrima gets displayed in demos and movie fight scenes, but at its core, it's still what it is, and it's a weaponized memory of colonization and rebellion and survival. And it didn't survive because people liked it. It survived because people need it. Because even under empire, people keep fighting with or without permission, and that's so. Like the other ones that I've mentioned, it's not just a martial art. Pencaksilat is not just a martial art. It's a fragmented mirror of Indonesia's colonial trauma, stitched back together and rebranded as national identity. The term Pencaksilat itself is a modern consolidation used to describe a vast ecosystem of indigenous fighting systems spread across the archipelago Java, Bali, Sulawesi. They all had their own methods, techniques, and philosophies. What they shared wasn't a single style, but a common enemy, colonial violence, first under the Dutch, and then eventually under the idea of the nation state itself. During Dutch colonial rule, which lasted over 3 centuries, Pencaksilat wasn't just discouraged, it was surveyed, criminalized, and systemically suppressed. Not because it was dangerous in the conventional sense, but because it was uncontrollable. Colonial authorities feared that the transmission of this indigenous knowledge as much as they feared any open rebellion. And Salat, passed orally and through lived practice, couldn't be taxed, it couldn't be standardized or co-opted, it couldn't be commodified. So they needed to erase it. It was literally a part of like the colonial process. But like any martial tradition that's shaped under oppression, it didn't just go away quietly. It went underground. It became part of everyday life in rural areas, disguised in ritual, music, games, religious practice. Salat wasn't just about fighting the colonizer. It was about preserving autonomy of your land and of your people in a world that was designed to strip you of all those things. And when Indonesian revolutionaries began organizing for independence in the early 20th century, Salat reemerged as a tool of both cultural and literal resistance. Fighters trained in Salat took part in anti-colonial guerrilla campaigns, but just as importantly, the art gave them a shared language of movement, discipline, and purpose, one rooted in a pre-colonial identity. And then after independence in 1945, the new Indonesian state did what new states do with any type of revolutionary tradition. It tried to fold it into its own national narrative. And Pencaksilat was promoted as a unifying national sport, a symbol of pluralism, strength, and authentic Indonesian identity. And it was taught in schools, it was performed for tourists, it became a national export. And again, in the same way as Taekwondo in South Korea and capoeira in Brazil, it is a tradition that is both necessary and destructive, and is pulled out of the forests and villages and placed under fluorescent lights in competition halls. And the state sanitized it, codified it, and regulated it. And in doing so, it took something fluid and insurgent and turned it into like a fetishized mascot, right? But the older versions of this in those places that it came from never went away. In the backyards and in the mosques and in the rural training halls, traditional Salat is very much still practiced and shared, not as a sport, but as anything else, a means of survival, and as a memory of what it meant to fight, like without permission, and to train under occupation, and to carry your history in your body, because it was never safe to write it down. And Pencaksilat is what happens when a people's movement doesn't die, it adapts. It becomes ritual, performance, resistance. Even when it's wearing a government patch, performing for diplomats, you can still see it for what it is. It's a weapon passed down in secret, designed for a world that didn't want its users to exist. It's that simple. And this, I didn't even know this, but Sambo in itself, I'm going to try to pronounce this Russian word. Samozajita bez urozia. Self-defense without weapons. It wasn't born. This is the same thing. It's the exact same thing. And this is the most perfect example of it. Because Sambo wasn't born in a temple or a village. It was born in a bureaucracy. It was developed in the Soviet Union in the 1920s and 30s. Sambo wasn't a cultural inheritance or the work of a single martial sage. It was a state project. It was literally a top-down response to a practical question. How do we build a new kind of human being for the post-imperial world? And the Russian Empire had collapsed in fire and famine, and the Bolsheviks had won the Civil War, but now they had to turn a war-torn peasantry and a traumatized working class into a functional military-industrial machine, which they did with Sambo. And Sambo was a part of that project from the very beginning. Vasily Oshkopov and Viktor Spiridonov, two military men who brought together techniques from Japanese judo, various Central Asian wrestling styles, Gregorian Chidoboda, and then Russian folk grappling. What mattered was not tradition. What mattered was like the legitimate material effective and utility of it. Could you throw someone? Could you subdue them without a weapon? Could you train thousands of people how to do it, and very fast? And so with that, Sambo became like a military technology, a Soviet martial art built to honor the ancestors of the revolution. It's literally, that's what it is. It is the combat strategy that built a proletarian army. It's a physical embodiment of the Bolshevik ideal. And I'm not being like a romanticist about it. That's literally what it is. It's a rational, efficient, class-conscious, ready for combat fighting style that the Soviets needed to create to unify itself and to create fighters out of regular people, to turn peasants into warriors. And the Red Army adopted it as part of its training regimen from the very beginning. Soviet sports clubs, essentially worker militias with kettlebells, spread it across to civilians. It was a self-defense method for the new Soviet masses, and fast, brutal, and like collectively dispersed of just like demonstrated collectively. But as everything with the USSR, ideology and paranoia were never far behind. And Oshkopov was arrested and died in prison in 1938 during Stalin's purges. He was accused of being a Japanese spy, mostly because he had studied judo in Tokyo, which is just insane to me. That the person that created, like one of the people that was known for creating Sambo, Stalin put in prison, essentially had killed. Wild. That didn't stop Sambo's institutional rollout, but it showed exactly how the Soviet state in that form had really betrayed its revolution, right? Build the revolution and then disappeared into a filing cabinet is very much how that era of like the Stalinist regime approached its historical predecessors, we'll say. And so in the decades that followed, Sambo was divided into two branches: Sport Sambo, which became a competitive grappling sport, and Combat Sambo, which remained tied to the military and police training, like what's his name? Fedor Emelianenko is famously known for his incredible combat Sambo boxing style. Peter Yan, also Sambo combat boxing style. Or even Krokop. Krokop has that type of style as well. Yeah, I mean, Fedor, one of the greatest athletes and just like coaches and minds of sport, like in a different, this is 1,000,000% the truth. In a different era, Fedor would be leading armies. So would Habib. Like in a different era, that's what these people would be doing. And that's like kind of what the point of what I'm saying in these rants. And that's how like combat sports is statecraft. And that's how it's still so close to power, like with Trump and with Putin, and like it's still right there because that's what it represents. It represents like struggle, and so then it represents whoever is uphold of the tools of struggle are the ones in power. And so that's so much of how it's maintained is through that. Not totally, because there's also soft power, like with soccer and hockey, which I've talked about a lot with in Canada. So both of these methods spread across the Soviet bloc. They're taught in youth programs and promoted as evidence of the USSR's superiority. And again, this is a key part, not just in ideology, but in human design. And this is like a huge part of why the Olympics was so important to the Soviets, because it was like the West had boxing, the East had Sambo, faster, smarter, grounded in like actual material usage. Someone trying to box like in an actual fight for your life, you're just going to get taken down and mauled and mounted and ground and pound and turned into a pulp, because that's not how actual fights work. And for a while, this approach worked. Sambo champions were understood in Russia and in the Soviet Republic as working class kids turned national heroes. It was a system that didn't just train fighters, it manufactured them. And it's crazy because like you see with Fedor, and like the spirit of Fedor literally embodied the Soviet Union long after the Soviet Union collapsed. And you could even almost say the same thing about Habib, because Habib in the crazy, like the Chechen ethnic way of like how that element of like the statecraft was then picked up by another, rebel force to then continue on to legitimately to this day be like he fought a fucking bear. Anyway, that was a meandering thought. So yeah, it was a system that didn't just train fighters and manufacture them. A state, not by law, but like by culture, a state with no gods needed, something greater, something else to believe in. And that was the project of the state, which could be embodied in oneself. And Sambo filled that part of the void. It was a secular ritual of discipline and domination. And today, the Sambo exists in the post-Soviet wreckage. It's tied to Russian nationalism, to the FSB, to Putin's image, only because of what I just said. Like the spirit of Sambo in fighters that exist today embodies the spirit of the revolution long after the revolution has died. And that's why it needs to be co-opted, and to this day is still like with Kadyrov and with Putin, like it's still so close to power at all times. But if you strip that away, you're left with something that is so much more interested in nuance. It is a martial art that is not born of myth and not born of like anti-colonial rebellion, but from like a meticulous, drawn-out plot in the wake of a revolution. A system asked, if you want to remake the world, what kind of bodies do you need to do it? And then so be it. And that's what Sambo was and still is today. All right, so Kayuk Sol-do, North Korean martial art, but calling it just that doesn't quite capture what it is. It's less a martial art in the traditional sense and more a state-forged combat doctrine, a synthesis of hand-to-hand techniques built in the ideological pressure cooker of North Korea's post-war militarization. Developed sometime in the 1960s and 1970s, Kayuk Sol-do emerged not from a village tradition or national folklore, but from, again, in similar to Sambo, bureaucratic necessity, the need to physically embody Juche, North Korea's ruling ideology of self-reliance in the form of a soldier. You could call it Pyongyang's answer to Sambo or a cousin to Taekwondo, but it exists in a completely different context where Taekwondo split in two, one version heading west, commodified and Olympicized, the other sticking to the older vision. Kayuk Sol-do never left the cage of the North Korean state. It was created internally for internal use, a martial system to train elite operatives, bodyguards, and special forces, and not for sport, not for diplomacy, but for survival and, if necessary, the spectacle of violence. And the techniques draw from traditional Korean arts like Haiwa Rangdu, but they're stripped of performance and ritual. They're also heavily influenced by Japanese karate, Chinese wushu, and Soviet sambo. So yeah, it's quite ironic. Like you see the essence of like the movement, and it's ironic considering how much the North Korean ideology is built on the rejection of outside influence, but you see on the contrary with Kayuk Sol-do. But like Sambo, right? Like Kayuk Sol-do is built on the selective memory and instrumental borrowing, right? The goal is not purity, it is raw efficiency. You see this most clearly in how the art is practiced. Training is highly militarized, often bordering on theatrical. Practitioners break bricks, jump through flaming hoops, disarm multiple attackers in choreographed sequences. It's not just training, it's performance for the state's myth-making machine. Footage of Kayok Saldu's demonstrations regularly appear in North Korean propaganda, showing hyper-disciplined warriors with explosive power and absolute loyalty. It's a visual argument for the regime's strength. If our bodies can do this, imagine what our missiles can do. Imagine what our state can do. But isn't about spectacle. It reflects like the material conditions of a country that's been at war, literally or ideologically, for almost a century. North Korea's emphasis on military readiness isn't a bluff. It's foundational. Everyone is a soldier. Every soldier is a symbol too. And in that context, Kayok Saldu isn't a pastime. It's a tool of indoctrination. It's a means of producing a citizen who is not just physically prepared for conflict, but internalizes the logic of the state through its movement. People could probably argue that there's an element of paranoia that's involved here, not in the same way as you see with other of these martial arts that I've talked about, because the state, like the actual bureaucratic state, has so much more control over this. But that doesn't make it any less effective. In fact, it might be the most effective like political tool of all for the North Korean people, because it's like similar to like soccer in some ways. Anyone can do it. And it's very much martial arts is ideology. Like it's built to reinforce the belief that the state is eternal and the individual only exists to serve it. It's like the holy trinity of like the state, like the higher power, the state, and the single autonomous person representing it. And like that's what, in a sense, Kayok Saldu is supposed to represent. And in like the way in which we are very much uncomfortable with that in how we observe Asian, Eastern culture and that like level of discipline and how we say it's authoritarian or whatever, it still serves the same thing, and it has the exact same like values that Americans military has, right? And because of that, we see them so much of a threat. And so, yeah, that's what it is. Like it exists to serve it through discipline, violence, but like in a choreographed way that it's like packaged neatly.
We've traced how fighting moved from the age of loneliness into the age of collapse, and how martial arts, once survival technologies forged in oppression, have been commodified into spectacle. But to stop here would only repeat the critique. What matters now is what collapse actually does to ritual itself. Because collapse doesn't just hollow things out. It doesn't just strip away meaning until only profit remain. Collapse also repurposes ritual. It takes practices born in survival and turns them into mass consumption. But the very act of repetition, of ritual, means something else survives too. Think about it. When capoeira was forced into dance, when salat was hidden in village ceremonies, when Sambo was drilled into workers' bodies, when North Korean CQD became a propaganda set piece, in every case, the practice carried a memory that exceeded the state's attempt to contain it. Collapse and co-optation change the form, but they don't erase the code that's been written into the body. Rhythm, reflex, posture. These carry memory even when the slogans are forgotten. And that's the paradox of collapse. The UFC doesn't resist it, it models it. The cage is the cathedral of late capitalism, but even inside that cathedral, something else leaks through. The rituals of training, fighting, even watching, preserve traces of the old survival logics that martial arts once embodied. Collapse makes those traces harder to see, but it also makes them more dangerous, because ritual always has the potential to flip back into resistance. This is bigger than combat sports. You can see the same dynamic in music, in protest, in digital culture. What looks like pure spectacle, a meme, a chant, a dance, a fight, can still carry embedded memories of struggle. Collapse pushes those memories underground, disguises them as entertainment, but it never fully extinguishes them. That's why states and markets are so eager to sanitize, codify, and brand these traditions. They know that even under layers of spectacle, ritual can remind people how to resist. So the new idea here is this: collapse doesn't end resistance. It drives it into ritual. It forces memory into muscle and rhythm, into gestures and movements that outlast the systems trying to commodify them. The cage obscures collapse. It turns systemic failure into personal drama. But in every punch, in every takedown, in every body that refuses to quit, you can still glimpse the echoes of older struggles. And that's why the fight fight game feels so honest, even when it's rigged as a business model. Not because it reveals collapse, but because it masks it in a form that's coherent, visceral, and ritualized. The audience doesn't just watch fighters, they participate in a collective ritual of collapse. We gather not to hope, but to feel something as the world burns. Yet even in that ritual, traces of older resistance persist. The lesson then is not just that combat sports mirror collapse, but that rituals of struggle can never be fully co-opted. They can be commodified, sanitized, turned into tourist attractions or Olympic sports. They can be wrapped in propaganda or sold as memes, but they always carry the memory of survival. They always carry the possibility of turning back into praxis. So yes, the cage is the cathedral of collapse, but it is also a reminder, however faint, that people have always fought back, even when they had to disguise their resistance as play, as art, as ritual. And in that sense, every fight is more than spectacle. It's a rehearsal for survival, for memory, for whatever comes after collapse.